I'm Matt. Really happy to be presenting here with Julia, and really appreciate Marie-Pierre and Samson and others for the opportunity. Something to mention on the way through, and you'll see it on the slide in Julia's title there, Research and UNESCO Chair Coordinator. Just to mention, if you're curious, that, and we'll get into the centre context in a little while as part of our explanation of how we approach some of the work that we'll be describing and I guess analysing in a way. But the UNESCO Chair in Equity, Social Justice and Higher Education is led by Professor Penny Jane Burke, who also directs the Centre of Excellence for Equity in Higher Education at the University of Newcastle. And this is a UNESCO Chair really focused on mobilising higher education as a vehicle for social justice that can address and challenge some of the conditions that undermine forms of progress aimed at reducing inequalities. So it's a much bigger and more visionary project than sometimes equity is allowed to be. And I felt it was just important to mention on the way through. So our presentation, we're going to bounce back and forward a little bit between myself and Julia, is titled Careful Curation, Exploring the Possibilities of Equity-Oriented Research and Publication Facilitation. So quite a mouthful. And I suppose we're wanting to focus on every word there, but landing on facilitation is quite intentional. This has helped us, I think, this opportunity to really think about how it is that at the centre we do facilitate processes of research and also dissemination collaboratively, and how it is that we work with both participants and the producers of these publication products, but also the experience of these processes. What are the standards of conduct we bring into those moments? And we're going to be sharing from a few different examples. Julia's going to be really doing some work there to share from some specific examples that really have helped us ask ourselves why we're doing certain things in certain ways. And what you're going to hear quite a bit about at times, you're going to hear mention of a collaboratively run journal with CERII and with colleagues here today, Marie-Pierre and Samson, who are on the executive editorial team with myself and Professor Penny Jane Burke and also Matthew Bunn. And this has been an exciting project for us to collaborate with your centre there, and also many colleagues who are interested in this notion of criticality, explorations of what equity can mean in higher education, and also reconceptualizing access far beyond processes of widening participation, but about who has access to what forms of higher education, questions of epistemic access and justice, these sorts of much bigger notions of access going on. This is a screenshot of a co-developed issue with colleagues here today that you would be able to engage with works by Marie-Pierre and Samson too. But I mention it here because you're going to hear a little bit about it as we travel through the session. Some of the things at play in that very article are questions of sort of politics of knowledge. Whose knowledge is seen to matter in higher education? Whose knowledges or ways of knowing are excluded, marginalized systematically through processes of, I guess, historical formation of the disciplines of higher education, the context of higher education. And it's really important to us, given at any time, but certainly given what we're here to discuss today, Julia and I really want to acknowledge on our behalf that we are sharing from a place in contemporary neocolonial Australia where, from the time of European colonisation, a formal education apparatus, including higher education, has been constructed that really has been well designed to systematically marginalise and subjugate the very sophisticated bodies of knowledge and ways of knowing that have been sustained by the First Nations peoples of this continent for many tens of thousands of years, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Our current Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Engagement and Equity, a man named Nathan Towney, an Indigenous man here at the University of Newcastle, recently put it this way: for generations, Aboriginal people have had to fit into a system that was not designed for us or by us. As a result, our histories, views of the world, and lived experiences have been excluded. In its place, success has been defined by the ability to fit into another culture. We're very proud to have Nathan as a Deputy Vice-Chancellor at our university. And in this seminar, we will be confronting the difficulty around things like a politics of knowledge in higher education. And so in commencing this seminar, we really want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the unceded lands from which we are sharing with you today, the Pambalong clan of the Awabakal peoples. And on all of our behalves, pay respect to elders past and present, and to recognise also that for each of you here today, there will be people and places that matter a great deal to you and that have helped shape who you are and what you bring together today. But as I've sort of said before, this seminar has really emerged from facilitating different processes of research or development of different publication, but also administering other sort of university processes here at the centre at the University of Newcastle, and visits from people like Marie Pierre and the opportunity to work with Penny and really trying to apprehend what does that make possible? What are the practices that might, in taking account of the state of higher education, put in a very general sense, what is still possible in terms of relating with and working with one another with respect and care. So we're going to give a brief overview of the centre because this is, we would argue, a unique centre driven by a very strong conceptual theoretical framework. We're going to bring in some older but really important work on academic capitalism as a way of sort of, and you'll be familiar with it, I'm sure, but just re-articulating what it is that, for example, things like the journal are, how they are situated. We're going to cover ground with which, Julia and I are probably a bit nervous because we've got such experts on conceptualizations of care and care in higher education. But I mean, you can help us out on that if we stumble into territory we're unfamiliar with. But we really think it's important, and we've engaged with it to try and think through what we are confronting and encountering. We're then going to think about, the concept in practice and the way that we draw in our multidimensional framework here at CERII to practice in those contexts. One of those frameworks being what we have termed relational navigation, and Julie will articulate a little bit more what that means and the standards by which we sort of carry ourselves in doing that work. And then we're going to finish with a little bit of work, which is something that I'm very passionate about, thinking about evaluation for equity and justice. And there's actually a special issue of the journal that is coming around at the moment and will be available at the end of this year, start of next year. And again, it's really helped us rethink the challenges of holding a journal like this, holding this space, and challenges around sort of inclusion, marginalization, absence. And so, and we've got some questions. And I suppose something to say from the top is that we're really not entering this seminar thinking we have solutions. We're wanting to sort of share and, yeah, entertain questions that we see as dilemmas, but one way of thinking about equity in higher education, I suppose, is sort of staying with the trouble of those dilemmas and making sure that we're not confidently proceeding when we might be doing harm.
So as Matt said, I'm going to give a brief overview of CERII just for some context in terms of the position from which we're asking these questions. So I'm sure many of you might be familiar with the Centre of Excellence for Equity in Higher Education. Certainly Marie-Pierre and Samson are as our sister centre. So CERII was established in 2015 under the leadership of Professor Penny Jane Burke and the late Jeff Whitty. As Matt was saying, the centre is also now a host to the UNESCO Chair, which has been a really exciting opportunity to extend the work to a more international setting. So CERII is a praxis-based centre, and we always endeavour to bring together research and programmatic action with a consistent dialogue between the two. As Samson and Matt have both mentioned, we're based in the University of Newcastle in Australia. The University of Newcastle has a long history and a very explicitly stated commitment to equity, though we might argue that doesn't always play out in the ways we might hope. Yes, as I mentioned, we're established in 2015. The centre works both within the institution, so in programmatic ways, through facilitation of research schemes, and also providing policy guidance into the institutional context. And of course, we work beyond that into the national sector and internationally as well. We have a really strong relationship with CERII, and through the co-hosting of the Access Journal, which, as Matt mentioned, we'll touch upon in one of the examples we're drawing on today. So just to give some more context about the conceptual framework from which we're operating within CERII, we've got this slide here which details the multidimensional framework, and this is what we aim to translate into practice as part of our praxis approach. So this iteration of the multidimensional framework was first developed in a large-scale international review that we did some years ago now, and heavily draws on the work of Nancy Fraser in terms of the social justice principles. Throughout the literature review process, we identified the prevalence of deficit imaginaries in the equity work that was coming through these very limited and large-scale database searches that were prioritizing certain types of knowledge and considerations of academic rigor. So this was the impetus for providing a new framework that allowed us to really think about what the intended outcomes for equity work should be and how we might include more complex understandings of rigor and diverse forms of knowledge, and to challenge the way that the deficit imaginaries kept coming into this equity work. So we'll talk about more about this in terms of how it comes through into the relational navigator framework in a few slides.
So just to follow on from there, for example, in terms of notions of rigor, the politics of knowledge, in terms of evidence production, there's kind of what it is that we feel we really need to stay aware of as we whether continue to develop the centre or collaboratively host a journal. And one really important part of that context, which I'm just going to provide a bit of a refresher for those who are very familiar with this work, or introduce it for those who are less so. And there's a history of work here by Slaughter, Leslie and Rhodes, 1997 and 2004 work. And so the 2004 work was really building on the earlier work titled Academic Capitalism. But this was work, and I suppose I'll start there and then talk about how our close colleague and leader Penny has drawn that into thinking about who has the right to higher education, what is the politics of knowledge and evidence production, including the construction of the problem of equity through research. How do these things interact, and how are those processes situated in this these social dynamics? How does that matter? And so I'm going to spend the next 5 or so minutes talking about this work, and then sort of we'll bring it back across to that context of equity in higher education and some of the centre's ongoing thinking about this. But if you're not familiar with this work, then the 1997 work by Slaughter and Leslie, sorry. And as I detail it, I'm sure you'll be very familiar with what is described, because this is work that was done some time ago, but it was cutting edge at the time, of course, detailing this at times slow, at times rapid creep in particular directions. So the 1997 work there by Slaughter and Leslie was really, it was looking at universities, mainly in the US, UK, Canada, and also Australia, and the shift towards sort of market-oriented practices, often in response to a decline in state funding. The main ideas around how higher education systems were increasingly being pressured into what we are very familiar now in terms of entrepreneurial behaviours, so chasing external research funding, recruiting fee-paying students, forming industry partnerships. They talked in that work about universities as, I guess, organisations and also individual academics that were being forced more and more so to compete for external resources in what they were calling quasi-markets. And importantly, certainly for the seminar today, knowledge being reconceived as a commodity, but in their analysis, still with some tension between public service ideals and the sort of market logics, market imaginaries, I suppose, too. It was largely a policy-driven analysis. Now, the later work by Slaughter and Rhodes really built on this and extended on it. But it showed how systematized this dynamic had become in terms of reconstituting universities and higher education systems in that image, around that impetus, around financialized, commercialized, commodified logics and structures. And so it was not just what universities were doing, but how they were being structurally reorganized within sort of the idea of an actual new economic sort of structures, practices. And so they were looking at governance, they were looking at management approaches and structures, they were looking at everyday academic practices too. And there was also in that later work greater attention on administrators and professional staff, of which Julia and I are. But so not just faculty, but the way in which professional staff had become increasingly key agents of that process of marketization. And all of the things that we are familiar with around different offices and marketing units and IP managers. And so knowledge not only commodified, but absolutely integrated into circuits of capital. So patents, research parks, proprietary technologies, and very much work that was situating higher education firmly within neoliberal globalization and the knowledge economy. And there's so much work that I'm sure you're all, as scholars associated with Marie Pierre, familiar with around and critiques of ideas about neoliberalism. I'm more of a fan of the notion of neoliberalization, and Penny and I have written about that quite a bit. We'll get into that in a sec. But certainly I want to reinforce that I suppose for Julia and I, our way into this work has been via Penny's work. And an aspect of Penny's work over the years, and you'll see her work there, The Right to Higher Education, back in 2012. This was very much a critique of aspects of the widening participation process, the way, for example, access education in the UK had been neoliberalized, to put it bluntly. And then also things like aim high were coming in and New Labour, and just how ideas of freedom and access were being reformulated. But alongside others in higher education scholarship, Penny's work has really helped to show how this other dynamic that Slaughter and Leslie and Rhodes are articulating really shaped claims to and ideas about progress towards what might be labelled projects of equity or access or widening participation, even social justice in and through or as a result of higher education. And this has certainly shaped our centre's efforts to bring, as Julia was saying before, research and practice together in ongoing cycles of reflection and action. Not because we would claim that it solves these sort of incredibly complicated global dynamics, increasingly globalized dynamics, but as a way to confront some of the worst aspects of this dynamic, we would hope, we would argue, as a way to stay with the trouble of sort of dilemmas. And we're certainly not claiming to be outside of those power relations. We are certainly subject to and subjects of those contexts. And so we want to always be mindful of that. And so this, in some more recent work, Penny and I, but certainly drawing on many others, including Marie Pierre's work, have really, in the Australian context, but broadly too, wanted to think about, well, what problem is higher education equity, diversity and inclusion, as it's often formulated here, and I know elsewhere too. What is it designed to engage with and solve? And how is the problem constructed? On what evidence? And certainly something I'm fascinated by is judged against whose values certainly in processes of program and policy evaluation, but also more broadly. And look, Penny's work, and we've been doing more work here at the centre, is sort of looking how, and it's endlessly reformulating, the problem of equity is often constructed, including through research, in this context of academic capitalism, as rooted in the deficiencies of individuals. And Julia mentioned before the sort of the literature review, absolutely identifying, whether it be in policy practice, research, or evaluation, these sort of deficit imaginaries. So not deficit language, but I mean, we'd all be familiar with notions of sort of discourse as what it is possible to say, imagine, be, do, and to be considered reasonable in a particular historical context. And so absolutely a much more insidious dynamic that lays the foundation for a reasonable discussion about equity in higher education. And so our rigorous review and literature review really attempted to sort of demonstrate what we had found in terms of the way in which a lot of the work that was highly influential was steeped in this deficit imaginary, a fundamental orientation that then would often there was a lot of strengths-based language in the mix, but it was always in our analysis a glossing over of the things that I'm sure this group are well aware of, the sort of systemic, structural, historically formed social inequalities at play. There's absolutely, in a lot of work, a tendency to leap to method without close attention to methodological, epistemological, ontological considerations that shape who is able to participate in these evidence production processes, knowledge production processes, what is seen as legitimate, worthy, reasonable of shaping the problem construction. I've mentioned it before, but this gaze of equity evaluation, often on measuring the attitudes or behaviours of of those navigating inequalities, inequities, and disadvantage, often through this sort of deficit imaginary, and something I'm sure you're very familiar with, the way in which context is often given lip service, but actually a sophisticated understanding of context is often lost or wantonly ignored. And I suppose as this marketization of higher education has taken hold through the rise of the sort of dynamics that Slaughter and Leslie and Rhodes and many, many others have articulated, including folks here today, equity has really become detached from an analysis of and efforts to redress social inequalities. And so equity is often absorbed with concerns, for example, you might all be very familiar with the aspiration raising sort of language and discourse as a primary strategy for designing and implementing equity interventions aimed at recruiting disadvantaged young people into higher education. And Penny's been a leader in terms of critiquing this as rooted in economic imperatives, as public funding of higher ed has been eroded and largely replaced with student loan arrangements, debt. It is based on the promise of forms of graduate employability, not meaningful work as many have critiqued, but this nebulous notion of employability. And so this is a good example that many have used, but Penny certainly, in terms of sort of aspirations that are able to be recognized are those that progress the sort of, let's say, neoliberal imperatives to expand human capital, ensure citizens are job ready. And so this welfare to work agenda has increasingly sort of animated a lot of policy as these dynamics have sort of reshaped higher education towards markets, industry, commercialization or commercializable commodities. And the pursuit of higher education as a space to engage with bodies of knowledge is increasingly being replaced with a sort of skills-based agenda for employability, certainly in Australia. It's absolutely built into, it's been legislated into Australian higher education through the Job Ready Graduates package. That demand for higher education is and should be driven by the aspiration of individuals to develop job relevant skills to help them re-enter the workforce. That is policy language, and yeah, we can talk about that another time. And so just to close this section and move to another section, we just want to just leave you with some questions here, because we're changing tack a little, but really the link here is that, well, at least for me, but this has been our discussion and our sort of our thinking in terms of, well, in those given what we're confronting there, what does it mean to facilitate research, grants, dissemination practices, host journals with others? Given these bleak conditions, what are the standards of conduct we would like to hold ourselves to? And in this case, and certainly as an aspect of the centre framework and practice, care is a prominent term. And so to talk about it today, but also this is something we attempt to hold ourselves to on a daily basis. We're drawing on the work of Joan Tronto, Marie Pierre, and we want to also acknowledge the recent special issue of the Access Journal with some beautiful artwork, some weaving there done by a local artist, Felicity Cocchiuzoli, herself a descendant of Indigenous people and country here in Australia. And so we really want to think about how we might relate to one another within these conditions and dynamics. And this is great because we've got care scholars with us, and so I'm really hopeful we can have a great discussion at the end. But as you know, a key contribution of feminist and care ethics is to move away from, for example, more universal or total moral claims, and to really engage with difference, and where empathy is built into the fabric of frameworks. And this is, if we're a center focused on flourishing and recognition and representation, then in terms of the many different political ethical frameworks that one might explicitly hold oneself to, absolutely, this is part of our set of commitments. And of course, the notion of the other is important in the study of personal and social identity, inclusion, exclusion. We live in worlds with others. Our sense of ourselves as subjects is determined by relating to and with. And so this is, of course, about how that identifying occurs with and from within these dynamics. And so, of course, and we'll hear a bit about the relational navigation framework in a moment from Julia, but absolutely, we want to consider the importance of relation, given that every identification is made through, for example, not identifying with or as some one thing, which of course brings in the importance of difference. Again, something Marie Pierre and Penny have worked a lot about in higher education, something I've learned a lot from and tried to bring into these sorts of work in higher education. But a difficult question, of course, is how do we relate to difference? There's so much talk about membership and belonging in higher education, and we find these difficult conversations to navigate because these are positive things, right? But of course, history is full of examples where belonging has led to demonization, exclusion, bullying, even genocide. And important to talk about in the contemporary moment. But with this equivalence between difference and danger, and as a norm, being abnormal can be tragically weaponized, as we know. This can be more or less explicit. The stakes can be different, more or less apprehendable. And this is certainly something that Penny's used in her ideas to explore in the context of higher education, for example, to be recognizable as a subject of higher ed policy. A person must be subjected to the discourses of disadvantage and repositioned as the widening participation subject, as the different, the other, and drawing on Edward said here. And so, yeah, I mean, these considerations go to the heart of equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts. How do we work across difference when we rely on it for personal and social identities? How can equity work be done without arguably the worst kinds of inclusion? For example, assimilatory dynamics prevailing. Is it possible to avoid the demand of those constructed as other by a dominant social group, that they find ways to become recognizable and includable within those dominant forms? And we see ethic of care and particular formulations of it as frameworks that intend to focus or take seriously relation and difference and its approach, or it's an ethics that can bring in questions and concerns we think matter to do with what good relations might mean across difference. EDI, so equity, diversity, inclusion initiatives, they always imply a need for change, but often they're very quiet on whose terms change should be made, on what evidence base. And so certainly we feel an emphasis on relations and difference. Other performs a guide of sorts on how to think about this change and how to pursue it. So we engage heavily with Toronto's ethical elements of care, in which we're speaking to experts: attentiveness, responsibility, competence, responsiveness, collective care. And certainly a key aspect of Toronto is obviously, you know, Nell Noddings and Carol Gilligan, and there's a long history there. But importantly, given the focus on relations and difference and what we've talked about in terms of the context of those power relations reconstituting higher education, is that Toronto's work as a political ethical framework, it's sort of distinguished from some of the more overly psychologized interpretations of care ethics through an elaboration of power rather than post-structural thinkers. And, you know, we certainly our way into this, we feel that's very important, given that all of the work is socially situated, always influenced, constrained, and produced through power relations in a particular historical social context. So these considerations of power also to help recognize how we're recipients as well as providers of care. And I think that's some of the most powerful aspects of Toronto's conceptualizations of care. Got here some of Marie Pierre's work, which I'm sure you've read. So care in academia and exploration of student parents' experience. And we've had the pleasure of hosting Marie Pierre at CERII a couple of times. I think that's right. And Newcastle, and it's really helped us to think more deeply about forms of care, forms of labour. Really love your work, Marie Pierre, and you're an inspiration to many here. And to remember who does the caring, what labours in higher education, so important. This special issue of access, it's an issue that, as you can read here, engaged with ongoing debates among scholars, policymakers, and activists in the field, and how they render invisible or visible and misrecognise or recognise carers through intersectional processes which are gendered, classed, or racialised. And you can see from this quote we've drawn out of the whole issue, which is a bit unfair, but we love it. We love it all, but this is, you can see in this quote from one of the pieces in the SI that some of the dynamics that we've already been discussing in terms of the impossibility of, or not, I guess the difficulty maybe is a better term, of escaping these competitive, individualizing dynamics that structure the conditions of, yes, academics and other staff members in rather inhumane ways. And so, yeah, the way we work in academia means we only pull together to a certain extent and ultimately have to negotiate resources against each other. And this was a paper with real sadness. It was a beautiful paper, but it was a really, it was almost an elegy to so much about academia, in my view. Yes, we are put in competition with each other. An important realization for me was that as an individual, you simply can't compete with these structural conditions. There is simply no awareness for the fact that life has to develop and grow. It is pretended that none of this exists. But for me, this is quite hopeful work too, in terms of staying with the trouble, confronting these dynamics, and continuing to speak about them. And so I suppose what we're hoping in this seminar is to articulate what it is that we've drawn from these experiences, and how it is we've tried to live up to them, I suppose, in terms of that careful curation and all.
Just briefly return to some of the CERII frameworks that we mentioned at the top of the presentation, and to touch on the relational navigation framework as something that was developed as an umbrella framework for the programmatic elements at CERII. So CERII has a suite of programs that connect under this umbrella of the relational navigator concept. And the relational navigators each draw on the principles of social justice articulated in the multidimensional framework and engage in an ethics of care as they walk alongside the students that they work with. Equity work, including the approach we've mentioned, that we're trying to sort of hold close, is often in our context only understood in relation to direct engagement with students. And this is coming up again and again in terms of funding conditions. But we also really have been talking for a long time about how the administrative or facilitative processes also can maintain these principles, not just within explicit equity centres or activities, but could make a difference and be quite transformative if engaged across the university. So over the years, we've aimed to articulate, including in how we report for our funding processes, the ways in which these principles and forms of equity expertise could inform our approach and ways of working in administration, facilitation, and policy creation. So some of the examples for the way that the Navigator framework, is used in practice in programmatic settings is program Live, Learn, Grow, which works with care experienced students, and Superb, which works with students who have refugee backgrounds. And each of those relational navigators, as I mentioned, is translating those principles into a practice. And I just want to acknowledge Alison Carter, who recently mentioned or named herself as the relational navigator, and that for Matt and I was a bit of a aha moment of something we've been working around and through for a while in articulating the work that we do as facilitators within and around the CERII programs and research projects. As Matt noted earlier, we're drawing on two examples to discuss how we try to bring in a relational social justice focused approach that strongly is embedded with an ethics of care. And we, as I think Matt mentioned as well, we really want to offer this not so much as, a case study of best practice, but as an invitation to engage with the constant questions and dilemmas that I think are essential in holding on to those principles. But certainly, as Matt also noted, we're not outside of these capitalist systems of higher education. And so what does it mean to be trying to do this, and what are the barriers and limits to what we can do in these spaces? The first example, as we've talked about throughout the seminar, is the Access Journal. And this is, of course, an ongoing collaboration with you, Samson and Marie-Pierre. And so please feel free to jump in as we look at that example. The second example is how we support applicants in competitive equity-focused grant processes. And there are many tensions in this process, and I'll touch on that in a moment. So some of the questions, well, just to take a step back, as you're aware, the Access Journal is something that we co-facilitate with CERII, and it was previously the International Studies in Widening Participation Journal. And in 2021, we worked together to reframe and rename the journal with the aim to renewing its commitment to providing a platform for emerging writers and practitioners, and really engaging in critical debates at the intersection of higher education and inequalities. In this reframing of the journal, we also really wanted to expand the international reach of the journal, and also something that's close to my heart is the idea of bringing in different forms of expression and opening up the journal to be quite a radical and creative space. And so something we have done with each special issue so far is have an artist contribute to the cover and aspects throughout the journals as a way to signal this interest in other forms of expression, and to, I guess, bring together the papers in a publication that has a quality as its own artifact. I'll touch on that again in a moment. So the questions that I've got up here on the screen are some of the things that we think about, and that maybe are challenges in the approach if we're aiming to hold these principles in each step of the process. Yeah, there's constant dilemmas and tensions as we do this. So for example, if we're looking at how does the journal represent new voices and formats to raise awareness, how do we then reach beyond our current networks, our disciplines, to build that in? And Samson, I would say that your dissemination of that has been really wonderful, and I think that has expanded the networks of the journal so far. But how do we continue to do this? How do we bring in people who are writing outside of their usual discipline? And again, in the care issue, we definitely saw that. In terms of the question of how do we ensure methodological, rigor through a supportive environment that doesn't simply defer to conventions, I think this is something that, and any of the executive editors, feel free to jump in here, but we're often challenged by this question as we as a centre, as a university and as a journal continue to be measured against these conventions in terms of people being able to designate time to a journal that's not high ranking. And so the inclusion of other formats is one way that we're hoping to resist that. But in the process and the time taken to support authors to write outside of those conventions, we have to acknowledge that labour and that is a real challenge in the current climate. And something else, so that final question, how do we avoid simply creating a static artifact? As I was mentioning, we've placed importance on the creation of a beautiful publication with a view to prioritising those non-written forms of expression. We also don't want that discussion to end at the point of publication and the first dissemination. And I think Marie-Pierre and you with Janine, the way that you hosted that launch last year for the care issue that allowed all the authors to come together and continue the discussion that you had created in the curation of the journal issue was such an amazing, I think it was a highlight of our end of year last year. And in terms of the way that that was appreciated by the authors and was seen as something quite unusual for the publishing process. And it's certainly something that Matt and the other editors of the new special issue have been talking about in terms of creating a community of praxis through the generation of a special issue. So there's some of the questions, and as Matt said, we might return to these at the end because these are ongoing questions and certainly something that we see as important to continue to hold through the editorial process. To move then to the second example that we're drawing on to sort of indicate the way we use these processes. CERII has a role in administering equity-focused grants. So we support colleagues to apply for external grants. We provide expert peer review through CERII members and also our external networks, including internationally. We provide administrative support, so I might help with budgets or other elements, proofreading, from large to small items. And we help people to navigate the central research processes. And we also provide advice on the context of the primary funding bodies. And in recent times, there's been a significant shift in a key funding body, which has seen a shift to more positivist forms of evidence, I suppose, and Matt, jump in there if you want to. And so in terms of navigating those expectations or criteria for those funding bodies, we're able to provide advice and context. And importantly, I think we're also able to engage in critical conversations with colleagues across the university to enable a more sophisticated or engaged approach to equity, whether or not they're successful in that project. We see that as having impact beyond the process of the grant application. So through these processes where it's often at times in tension or conflict around things like the centralized processes which require largely times for sign-off, it's very much focused on ensuring that compliance and audit processes are in line, which is of course incredibly important, but can really mean that there is very little time for critical engagement with the application, with peer review processes, but we still aim to make sure that we can provide as much support to applicants as possible. We've also supported people to access university data, and again, that's an interesting consideration in terms of the way that can be accessed, the way it can be discussed. And then there's also sensitivities around the different approaches to equity people might be bringing to play. And of course, we want to support that application, but in some cases, we might try and really have that critical discussion at that point of application. And I just want to note as well that There are many research administrators across the university that do really approach this work with a strong ethics of care. And so it's certainly not like we're alone in providing that support. So some of the questions that we have up here around these processes, and again, as I mentioned, there's constant tensions, but how do we reach colleagues across the university and they're not the colleagues that we know or that are actively engaged in equity at all times? And in the recent round, we've been really pleased to work with a early career researcher in dietetics who has developed a really interesting project around work placement for students, neurodiverse students. So that's something that we really need to, and as Matt was saying, there's been some really helpful moments in formulating this seminar, and I think that's something that we really will take on with renewed vigor, is how do we reach across the university? And then in terms of the limited timeframes and the different, situations across the institution, how do we share knowledge and expertise from within our centre and networks to support new project development? And this is we're often doing this in shorter and shorter timeframes. And I think something that does come up for me, and Matt and I have spoken about this, is can we really challenge these competitive and neoliberal notions of success? We're still very much working within this competitive system. Sometimes it's to, this we see exciting projects funded, but that should really be coming from within the university. They're staff members who are seeing where something could be improved in and above their role. And it's wonderful if that's funded, but it's a shame sometimes that this is requiring external funding and that it's not valued within the institution in the same way. How do these processes relate to the university's stated commitment to equity? And I think that's getting to the same point there, where the university has a strong statement of commitment to equity, but often these projects or these initiatives require external funding.
We're getting close to the end in terms of what we were hoping to share, but I think, those questions there, really, we were hoping to form up a discussion in a few minutes with you. We just wanted to close with a few minutes talking about something that the centre is really fired up about and doing a lot of work around with colleagues. And this notion of evaluation can be spoken about in many different ways. We arguably, our orientation to our realities is evaluative in terms of the judgments of the quality of our coffee or the quality of a seminar. But there are so many contexts of evaluation in higher education, and whether it be of research, whether it be assessment of student learning, staff performance review and development, but a focus that we're bringing forward, and we're mentioning it because it's the next special issue of the Access Journal, and what we're seeing is some dynamics that we think are really important, and they kind of echo some of the things that Julia's just mentioned there in terms of who is coming forward and why. And how it's really making us think about the way in which we're facilitating that process of, I guess, coming into the foreground, the care required to do that work, and who is ready to do that work. And these are obviously part of the ethical elements of care we might think about. But just want to do a minute of setup. So why are we interested in evaluation? Well, we want to interrogate what gets valued in program and policy evaluation, because we think that matters for equity and justice in higher education. Program evaluation is finding things out, generating knowledge about people or practices that will make decisions and judgments about them, their merit, their worth. And in this process, things get valued over others, things get left out. And this valuing process will determine the type of knowledge that gets created, the effects of that process, and these have implication for participants, the program. Things get scaled up, things get shut down, everything in between. can be a process that's quite supportive, can be a process that's quite fear-inducing, and I'm sure we all have experiences of this. And we really take this focus because we're alert to the risk that evaluation is a very, very effective tool for the reproduction of dominant value frameworks. We feel a way through this, and drawing again on sort of some of the frameworks that CERII is fired up about, these histories of thought about, for example, parity of participation, to use a Fraserian sort of conceptualization of social justice possibility in a particular context. But we're certainly skeptical of policy and program evaluation approaches that are conducted at a distance from the lives and perspectives of the people an initiative is intended to benefit. And so our commitments are more to sort of social justice through and in education, lifelong learning. And so for us, for any evaluation to be serious about understanding and furthering those commitments, it needs to be able to respond to and with people who participate in those contexts. In terms of what type of knowledge is wanted or needed from an evaluation, let's take Indigenous ways of knowing in the Australian context. They do not fare well in conventional processes of evaluation, with horrendous historical and ongoing consequences. This is to generalize, but for example, oral traditions are entirely swept aside in terms of ways of knowing, songline, story, and not your sort of glib, superficial story of a student. This is a an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander conceptualization of story that is much deeper, and these things are not seen as legitimate knowledge in Australian higher education. I'm sure you'd be familiar with this in other contexts. Things that you'd be very familiar with that have been heavily critiqued in terms of what works that closes down, leaves out so much, and these largely unacknowledged ways of obscuring whose values are at play. We feel it's an entirely impoverished set of approaches. And so we think evaluation needs to take its ethics very seriously. And for us, that gets into notions of participation, pedagogy, and ethics. The current special issue is looking at, well, the call was absolutely for work that, and this is only a very small part of the call, but yeah, as you can see there, how people are attempting to navigate sort of different ethical dilemmas that with forms of transparency, reflexivity, and a commitment to shared decision making, for example. And so we were inviting contributors to interrogate these dominant value systems that might resist the subjugation of marginalized knowledges, reimagine evaluation as a tool for transformative change. So really that invitation to not only critique some of the aspects of conventional program and policy practice in higher education and beyond, but to look at new forms that might claim to do differently. And just to finish up, some of the examples, and this is why we're sharing this, that are coming through, we are absolutely being told by authors in this special issue that the process, the way it is being conducted, has meant that they have been able to stay involved, and that usually, and well, certainly they've shared this, that the experience in other contexts has been that for whatever reason the pressures on them and their in their lives as academics and practitioners has meant that they have been kept out, or the questions and concerns they're raising are not seen as legitimate in the field of sort of policy or program work. And so all of the sort of approaches and practices Julia was sort of detailing before, again, we're not offering them as necessarily, like, this is not a showcase of solutions. It's just stuff we're hearing, and we're almost alarmed that these are seen as unique and powerful moments where we feel it just shows how, and I know I'm not telling you anything new here, we've got people who are very familiar with the REF, for example, but how alarming it can be that the experiences people are having that when we're having a more flexible, responsive, I would argue careful process of curating the process, that people are seeing it as so refreshingly new and different and humane, which is kind of scary. And so we're interested in this idea of the process performing and producing as well as the final artifact. I'll stop there. Thanks all for showing up. It's been great.
Thank you, Matt and Julia, for this wonderful presentation.